Hello, my dears. I guess I'll start with my intro because that makes more sense for today's content. So, hi there, hello. My name is Sydney, pronouns they, them. I am an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, media analyst, and disability advocate. Currently working on a thesis about disability education, media, theater, performance, accessible education, basically anything else in any and all of those categories, and it's culminating in the world's first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. You can learn about all of that at the links in my description. And I am a white person in their early 20s with light brown curly hair that is in a ponytail, and I am currently wearing a white button-up shirt with a Peter Pan collar, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf, and I have clear round glasses on. Yeah, I think that's all the things. Now, something that I often say in my disability media reviews is how it's clear that something was made for a neurotypical audience, or it's clear something was made for an abled audience. Usually as a criticism of the work, I also feel that way with a lot of queer and trans representation. It feels like it's made for non-queer people or non-trans people. And as I've been figuring out how to direct this thesis, which is a text that was written for a neurotypical audience that I want to somehow portray in a way that helps them to understand neurodivergent and autistic people while also making my neurodivergent and autistic viewers feel entirely at home and like it's about them, I've realized that the question of target audiences not only affects how you create your art, but it's also a lot more elusive of a problem than one might actually think, which then led me to think about like all the issues that we're having in the wider entertainment industry and how people are constantly complaining about how everything's an adaptation of something, or in the theater world, everything's a jukebox musical and a musical based on a movie. And so much of the media that we consume just feels very recycled of late, especially in regards to minority representation, both the rep that we have and the fact that we still have very limited representation. And I wanted to know, why does that happen? What led us here? If we can break out of it, and if so, how can we work to break out of that? Do I have all the answers? No, I do not, but I figured that I have enough thoughts to make a video and start a conversation that you all might have thoughts on and want to add to, and maybe we can find some cohesive answers at the end of the day, because when I first had these thoughts, I went to research, as I always do, to try and get the answers and see opinions of other people on the topic to try to, round out my argument, and I couldn't really find much in the realm of it at all. Like, maybe I looked wrong, that's possible, but I also think that in the realm of representation, discussions of who is this for have come up in case studies about things that either went really well or really poorly, and not really as solo conversations themselves. So the first thing I asked myself was, what precisely does it mean when I say that this thing is made for a neurotypical audience? Like, what does that mean? And my preliminary thought is like, it's just a vibe. Like, it really is just, you can feel it, but that's not concrete or helpful. So I had to go back and put things into words, and I kind of concluded that generally it's the feeling of over-explaining an experience to somebody who doesn't know anything about it, just kind of shoehorn into the narrative sort of, and having your minority identity feel like it's being picked apart through a magnifying glass rather than being lived, if that makes sense. Like, it's like they try to tell your story from a you perspective, but in reality, they end up telling people what they think your story might be like from a you perspective, with a very weird level of narrative distance from the actual reality of it all. Like, for example, in Curious Incident, which I'm just going to be citing for the rest of eternity, so if you're not familiar with it, I have a dramaturgy video about it up here that should help somewhat, but I also just recommend reading it. Anyway, so much of the first act of this play is just him being like, I think this way because I think this way, and that is why I do these weird things. And it actually makes sense if you know that this is why I do the weird things. Where if I'd written that for an autistic audience, he probably wouldn't explain those things, he would just do them, and everybody would be reasonably chill with that. But then there also lies a catch-22 of sorts, because what I always loved about Curious growing up and why it meant so much to me growing up is that I heard somebody explain the world in a way that I understood for the very first time. And looking back, I take issue with how spoon-fed to a neurotypical audience it is, but early on in my identity, I needed that to hold on to as proof that I was not insane and that I was just a normal, regular autistic person. So we're gonna table that issue for a second. Some other things that I've noticed in making disabled stories for abled audiences is a manufactured level of smoothness or aestheticism, removing the messy, ugly, inconsistent parts of disability and trying to make it more palatable to look at or listen to. A common thing that we see in media that includes deaf people, but is made by and for hearing people, for example, is camera shots that obscure the hands so you can't actually see the signing. And you also don't hear deaf accents very much because they just try to avoid those. Not all deaf people speak, and not all deaf people speak with deaf accents, but they're, in a lot of cases, are very specifically, like, it seems like they did their best to avoid the noises that deaf people make in how they construct the media. It also includes treating normal everyday things like they're a very big deal, or using those normal everyday things for dramatic effect when that logically makes absolutely no sense, or using everyday occurrences that nobody pays attention to in the community as the butt of a joke. And like, disability is hilarious. I will say, like, the disabled experience can be very, very funny, but when the only time they bring up elements of the disabled experience is to be comic relief, that feels a little weird. But generally, a lot of the "this is for a neurotypical or able-bodied audience" things really come down to the vibes. Like, you can tell if something is fluid and authentic versus stiff and heavily researched to try to fake authenticity. And you can tell when something is fluid and authentic, but then they're told that they need to explain this experience to a different audience, which ends up stiffening it and stifling it a little bit, which sounds weird when you say it out loud, but it is the truth. And when you start paying attention to it, you can kind of tell which fits into which category. So then my next question was, well, okay, so then what would art look like without a majority target audience? And my images included things that include like the weird inside jokes of minority experience that if you heard somebody in the majority say the same joke, you would find that really offensive, but you can make that yourself because you're in the minority. Minority representation not meant for a majority audience would also probably be a lot messier in the sense that you're not focused on what tropes you might be fulfilling or defying or how a story might come across to an audience unfamiliar with your minority. But in that case, then we often get what I call the baby gay conundrum or the baby neurodivergent conundrum, which is the thing where somebody new to a minority community thinks that they therefore know everything about it solely because of their lived experience, but they accidentally hold a lot of really outdated and like internally ableist or internally homophobic views because they haven't gotten deep enough into the community to learn that those things are things they need to unpack and that bioessentialism is a thing that we take issue with, or transphobia can be accidental. Like, I think a lot of sketchy activism happens in those first couple years of identity. And I say that as somebody who started a YouTube channel about their identity during the first couple years of that identity. Like, we've learned a lot since then. But those are the people that hold on to Curious Incident as a lifeline because they haven't been introduced to better options yet, and it's the only resource that they have. And there's nothing wrong with this, but it does mean that if we made all of our minority representation solely for an audience of people in that minority, specifically, we inevitably also leave out the people who are new to the community, who need those little bridges that we put in place to help the majority of people understand our experience, for them to know that they are welcome and safe in this community and that they aren't alone. But then we also need to like just look at reality and realize it's pretty unlikely to see mainstream media made exclusively for a minority audience anyway, because that's not particularly profitable. So the thought exercise is sort of a moot point anyway, but yeah, we're going to talk about profit. That's always the center of this whole conversation. We all want to believe as artists that we create art just for the sake of and the fun of creating art. And I do believe that it is possible for people to do that. But we also live in a world where to be an artist means on some level to try to figure out how the heck to monetize that art so that you can make a living. Because capitalism is always here to ruin the day, no matter what we do. And when you're making art, even when you try not to, there's always that thought of like, how are other people going to receive this? Like when I'm composing a song, for example, rather than like, oh, does this feel accurate to my experience or reflect how I'm feeling or just plain sound nice? My thoughts are usually, does this sound too angsty? Does this lyric make sense? Will people listening to this wonder if I'm okay? Is this the message I want to portray with this media, etc., etc.? Like even when it's just a random thing that I never intend to release or do anything with, I still think in terms of how it might be received, just based on habit. And even in creating new works, ones that are deliberately trying to be new and creative and break out of these little boxes, we end up getting caught in the same questions of how is this going to play to other people and will it be monetarily successful? Which brings me to the idea that everything we see these days feels recycled and or is an adaptation of something. Because we complain about how all movies these days are either sequels or based on books, and in the theater community it's jukebox musicals and every musical is a film adaptation. But why is this? Well, profit. This isn't surprising. Like, regardless of industry, as expenses go up, people want to know that they're going to like the thing that they are paying to see because it's expensive to pay to go see art right now. And it always has been on some level, but it feels like it's getting worse. And like, I would rather pay $20 to see the sequel to a movie I really liked than try to see something I've never heard of before. And then Broadway is like $120 minimum. So of course people are going to want to see Wicked or Beetlejuice rather than Kimberly Akimbo or Between Riverside and Crazy. Like, this logically makes sense. And this pushes investors to invest solely in known entities that have a name recognition for a stronger return on their investment, meaning that the market is going to be saturated with remakes and recycled versions of the same story. Also from just in the sense of Broadway, from a profit and investor perspective, a lot of investors are holding on investing in new things right now because the industry is struggling post-pandemic. And so we're really going to see even more of an uptick in intellectual properties we already know coming to Broadway in probably the next couple years, if not next like half decade, because of things that are being put into production and that people are investing in as money gets worse on Broadway. So it's an interesting thing to look at. It's also terrifying as somebody who's writing for a musical, but it's fine. We're good. Another interesting byproduct of this whole situation is as ticket prices increase, the people with that disposable income to spend on seeing new works are going to be in a very particular majority demographic. It's widely talked about in the industry right now how the majority of Broadway's audience of late is white people over the age of 40, because they're the ones who can afford to see a bunch of Broadway shows at full price. This is a similar phenomenon happening with movies in theaters as well, but it's more common in Broadway. And the fact that most major media reviewers the industry listens to, which then decide how your media performs, are in the same demographic of white people over the age of 40, doesn't really help the situation, because it means that while investors are putting their energy into remakes and recycles, they're also investing in the content that's going to be enjoyed by the target audience of people who can actually pay full price to see it, and to impress the people who are going to review that media and will therefore convince more people to pay to go see it. So no matter what we do, no matter how much older white people become the minority in our country, we still live in a world that caters media to what we think that they like because they're the best guaranteed return on investment, which is disgusting. And I hate it here. But this is why our minority representation still looks like, this is this person and they are in this minority. This means that they look like this and they experience things like this and they are different, yes, but they are also human, much like you and I. Because people assume that we still need to introduce minorities to the people consuming the content, because oftentimes that is sort of kind of the case. Not as much anymore though, that's the thing. Like, at this point, I think even your grandparents have probably heard of trans people. Like, we don't need to be like, this is a concept you've never heard of before. We can be more fluid in that dialogue. And anyway, what can we do about this? Because when it comes to Broadway, I got nothing. I try to support new works as best I can, but Broadway is expensive, so that is very difficult. And I try to support minority stories as best I can, but there still aren't many of them because of this whole target audience disaster. And as a creator of new works, this terrifies me. But when it comes to TV and movies, we actually have more of an answer on that one. Yes, we still have the market saturation. Like, if everybody likes this one movie, Netflix is probably going to make 4 of knockoffs of that movie, because algorithmically, if they make 5 of effectively same films, you're probably going to watch all of them one night as you procrastinate going to bed. But streaming platforms are also changing representation as we know it. It's not ticket sales that prioritize the elite because they can buy more tickets, but rather a set amount of money that everybody pays, and we vote for what we like based on our streams. And we get the chance to choose a bunch of different things that we like and try out new things and then dump them, or watch the same comfort show over and over and over again, and the streams accumulate to make a profit for the business. And because of the nature of streaming, they're not fighting for time slots on a cable network, and they can make a ton of random stuff for a fairly low budget and then just kind of see what sticks. They also don't need to worry about pleasing everyone, because one person watching something 5 times is the equivalent of 5 different people watching it once, with no extra cost to anyone involved or concern about who is tuning in to watch a show once a week, which means that they can get away with making more risque content and more niche content and more minority content than you would see by big movie companies in theaters or on regular cable TV. But does this fix the minority representation needing to be changed for a majority viewing audience? On some level, kind of. Films like Crip Camp, a documentary that shows the disability experience without cutting any piece of it, can be wildly successful because people can try something new without having to pay extra, and they learn about the disability community and our history for the first time, and they get more interested in other disabled media. That wouldn't have been able to happen without a streaming service. And I know that various streaming platforms have had this experience with other shows and films that show minority life truthfully and authentically, because they know that that niche is going to watch it, maybe on repeat, and will love it enough to recommend it to others outside of that minority, and other people might just see it come up when they're recommended and think, why not branch out? Seems interesting, and the platform can still turn a profit from it. But the thing is, in the times before streaming platforms, groundbreaking minority representation that introduced new people to the queer community was successful on cable TV. Will and Grace, a show about a gay man and his straight best friend, ran successfully for 11 seasons, all of which I have seen. I grew up on Will and Grace. And watching it, it doesn't feel like it's for a gay audience or for a straight audience. is somehow, which I never really thought about until I was trying to figure out why Our Flag Means Death works so well. And I realized that they kind of did the same thing. They never aggressively explain the representation. They just make it fit within the time period, and they make the characters human and multifaceted, and they don't avoid the realities of being in the minority, but they also don't aggressively center the characters solely around just the fact that they're that minority. They might throw a line or two of exposition as necessary that would be normal in a real conversation, and maybe leave in some Easter egg jokes for those who are in that minority community but have wider things so that everybody else doesn't feel left out. Kind of in like growing up when you would watch a Disney film with your parents and there's an inappropriate joke that your dad laughs at and you don't get it and you're like, what? But then there's already another joke that you get immediately right after, so you don't actually pay attention to the fact that that thing went over your head. This structured representation is a way to sit in the middle, which includes people regardless of identity and being authentic to that identity without looking at it through a magnifying glass and without also aggressively just being like, this is this identity, all while continuing the story along. And people will inevitably learn more about that identity, because I've noticed that, like, as cathartic as it feels to have some extra exposition about a minority experience in a show or film, if it's either early on in the piece or it's too long or it doesn't fit naturally into the way the rest of the piece works, people feel less like they're meeting people and more like they're meeting representations of a two-dimensional thing that they don't understand, and it feels weirdly shoehorned in, and it feels alienating to those people that we're trying to bring to understand our community. Like, I can picture my grandparents complaining as to why they needed to include a political message in a TV show, despite that not really being the case at all. It's just kind of how it comes off to a lot of people. And since a lot of minority people use examples on TV or in movies to help explain their experience to their family, having a non-binary character like Jim from Our Flag Means Death, who just isn't a girl, but isn't a guy, but is just Jim and has like a whole life and exists and functions and is fine, and people use they them pronouns for them and everybody's chill about it, that's going to make a lot more sense to somebody who's newer to the world of trans identities than a character who walks into a TV show and explains their entire gender identity. So I don't think there's an answer to any of these things that I'm bringing up, really. I don't think that there's a solution to making better and more inclusive art that's going to be completely foolproof, particularly when money goes in directions that make the most returns on investments. And for some reason, people still don't see minority audiences as a profitable group to market to. Not to mention that a lot of the money just comes from elite people. So elite people are going to, invest in more elite work. But I will say that the elite is starting to include minority people who are trying to fund work that includes minority people. Or in the sense of Our Flag Means Death, it's kind of just a bunch of people making a passion project, and they decided why not add some more nuance and add a little bit more going on in here. And they did, and it was really great. And that happens with casting as well. Like, things change when you cast minority people who want to include their stories in a way that feels fluid to the script. So I think a big part of this is how can we get authentically diverse people in front of and behind the camera, or on stage and backstage. So I think that's a big part of it. But either way, I think this is an interesting discussion and an interesting starting point. These are the thoughts that have been swirling around in my little brain as a creator, trying to figure out, how do I create the art that I want to create and that feels authentic to me, that's also for a market that doesn't want me there? And I would love to hear what sort of things that you all have to say on the topic, if only to make myself feel better, but maybe we can all support each other, I don't know. In the meantime, as always, thanks for listening, thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.